Hello, we're doing Guardini, part 4, which is the, On the Road to Jerusalem, chapter 5, on Moses and Elijah, okay? And what we're going to look at now is a question he raises about the Transfiguration that Guardini raises. When you read the synoptic account of the Transfiguration, all too easily we overlook the appearance of the two men who are seen conversing with Christ. What are they doing here, Moses and Elijah? One, the lawgiver, and the other, the prophet. But why precisely these two figures? Why Moses and not Abraham? Guardini asks. Why Elijah and not Isaiah or one of the other prophets? So he starts answering that question like right away. Guardini does. Yes, he says, why not Abraham? That dynamic figure with whom faith among men began in earnest. Abraham was a wealthy, childless man who enjoyed high esteem in his own country. Then God summoned him away. In his old age, he was to become the father of a nation, the beginning of a tremendous history. To this end, he must leave everything and follow God. The command is no light one. It's not so much the going away that is difficult. Wanderlust was in the blood of those people at that time. But the going in obedience to a promise utterly contrary to the laws of nature. Okay? This was Abraham's greatness. His faith, his persistence in that faith, even after a quarter century had rolled by and he had passed the 100-year mark. Still, Abraham hoped. Unspeakably great, then, says the fulfillment of the promise when at last his son was born. So, Guardini's reflecting on what a great, patriarch Abraham is, okay? Several years later, the centurion is again summoned by God to leave his home, this time to proceed to Mount Moriah with the boy. He's going to sacrifice his only son? Without losing his faith in the promise that from his loins was to spring a great nation. Thus, Abraham becomes the father of all who believe. So, about Abraham glows illimitable hope, before him inconceivable promise. God had told him those many years ago that he should look out into the Mesopotamian night at the stars. Great as their superabundance would be the riches of the fulfillment which the future was pregnant. That's in Genesis 15. This then the quality of the hope and the blessing in which the man had lived. Yet it is not he who comes to speak to Jesus when the nation he has fathered fails. So Guardini ties the fact that Abraham doesn't show up to the fact that the nation was failing God at this point. And Guardini goes on to say, had the Transfiguration taken place at the time of the Sermon on the Mount, which is closer to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when the tremendous possibilities of the promise were still alive, Abraham might have come. But not now. Now it was Moses who came. Why? So that's the backdrop. It's Moses that comes, not Abraham. So Guardini begins his description of how Moses fits in. So who is Moses? He's the court favorite until he had to flee the results of his death blow to the Egyptian. Moses too was commanded by God to perform a specific mission. On Mount Horeb, he was to lead the people out of Egyptian captivity. Moses demurred, probably because he realized what he would be in for. about the figure of Abraham is an air of divine largesse, spaciousness, illimitable possibility. On Moses presses the weight of a terrible yoke. Okay? So Moses is carrying this terrible yoke. And Guardini says Moses' heavy tongue is only one expression of that yoke. The nation of Abraham is now a reality, Guardini continues, a large nation and a strong one, but it's enslaved. And Moses' task is to guide it back to freedom. Now, Guardini shows something here that I've never thought about when we're looking at salvation history, but it's worth pondering. Again, these are sketches that Guardini is presenting us with to make us think about the possibilities of what Revelation may well be teaching us. Here's one of a good example of how Guardini stretches our theological and spiritual imagination. So here, this meant not only liberation from Egyptian domination, and then Guardini says, in parentheses, God was with the Jews, and had they earnestly desired freedom, who would have been able to prevent them? End of parentheses. The trouble, says Guardini, was that fundamentally they were not too discontented with their lot. Okay? Certainly they had cried to God, imploring his aid, but they would have considered an alleviation of their forced labor and improved living conditions a satisfactory answer to their prayer. The real problem was to shake these masses out of the torpor of an existence in which the necessities of life were provided for. After centuries of bondage, they were now suddenly ripped out of their security and sent into the desert, into an unknown existence that demanded both courage and initiative. To free them from their own shackles, from their refractoriness and stupor, that was Moses' thankless task. It required endless effort, says Guardini. While Moses spent 40 days on Sinai in intense prayer and fasting, even when he stood in the presence of God, receiving from him the tablets of the law, terrible things were happening in the Hebrew camp at the foot of the mountain. Aaron, the high priest, had collected the people's jewelry and poured a molten calf. And when Moses descended from the height, he found them in the midst of a riotous cult. The people sat down to eat and drink, and then they got up to dance, says the scripture. A riotous cult. Incensed, he sent the stone tablets crashing to the ground. The gesture is symbolical. Moses has been commanded to enforce the will of God against the obdurate will of this people, to free them from their own servile tendencies. He has well been called the most plagued of men. Okay? This was no easy thing to do. The story of the 40 years wandering through the desert is the story of a never-ending struggle, not only with the hardships of nature and the assaults of hostile tribes, but also with the apathy and stubbornness of those he was leading. At first the people are enthusiastic, but soon discouraged. They bind themselves with sacred vows only to forget everything when it comes to the test. They start everything well but see nothing through, and the moment they meet with difficulties, the experience of God's great and terrible signs is completely forgotten. So they react like any mass of humans under pressure, yes, more paltrily than other peoples in an armed march would have permitted themselves to react. Then again, they are senselessly bold and plunge without warning headlong into disaster. Often, one has the impression that they feel nothing of the glory of their march. Okay? That they are insensible to the power of the advancing God who hovers protectingly over them. That they are completely blind to the greatness of their leader. They make constant demands. They're stiff-necked, torpid, malicious. The record of the march to the promised land is the story of the desperately heavy struggle of a powerful God-fearing will with the crushing burden of humanity. Moses had to carry the entire nation on his shoulders. He was necessarily the most patient of men. Remember, the other translation is Moses is the meekest of all men. But the meekness of Moses has to do with patience. And, you know, meekness, what is meekness? It's the virtue that restrains vengeance, right? And you got that very dramatic moment when he restrains the vengeance of Almighty God. Okay? Sometimes, Guardini says here, it's as though he has to bear the additional weight of God's wrath. When, for example, the Almighty loses patience and says to Moses, "Let me destroy them." Okay? But the leader of this blind, unmanageable people stands his ground. Even when blows rain upon him from both sides. Well, Moses is really, he's got a real challenge there. Okay? He remains true to his terrible charge of middleman. However, the test is such a sore one that once his faith fails, at the moment when he's required to call forth water from the rock, in his own eyes, he appears ridiculous. As punishment, God assures him that he will lead his people to the border of the promised land, but that he himself will not cross over. Okay. Well, that's sort of like, I mean, what this reminds me of is an expression of Pope Francis. He says that the shepherds should smell like the sheep. Well, Moses ended up smelling, as it were, like his own people in that incident, striking the rock twice when God commanded him only to strike it once. Okay? And so, you know, but God stayed faithful to Moses because he continued to talk face to face to him as a man is wont to speak to his friend. He remained his friend. But Moses' life, too, ends upon the mountaintop from which God shows him the land that he may not enter. This, then, says Guardini, the man who appeared to Christ, to him who was to carry the cross of his people to the bitter end. Moses, too, they had failed to follow in the flesh into the new land of free divine dominion. Yet another leader had to die on the mountaintop, in quotation marks, in parentheses, this one for our sins, not his own, end of parentheses, before the promised country could become reality. Okay? See the tie-in? And Elijah. It is not too much to call him the mightiest of the prophets. And now, why is he the mightiest of the prophets? Guardini qualifies this. Not as a speaker. There's no record of exalted or path-blazing words from his lips. He left no book. Hardly a sentence that is in itself is anything out of the ordinary. Nor did he have any remarkable visions or revelations. Yet no other prophet looms as huge against the bottomless depths of divine mystery as Elijah. Nowhere in the whole history of prophecy do we find an existence of such huge proportions. However, it's insisted in the immediacy of the moment And that moment is terrible. Now, that's so what Guardini is saying here, and he's going to explain it more, is that Elijah is confronting one of the darkest moments in Israel's history, the reign of King Ahab. This is a man who hated God. He so hated God that down the centuries it was said that because of him, God's wrath still hung over the people of Israel. There he stands in the book of Kings. He's a prototype of rebellion, says Guardini here. With him his wife Jezebel, who was even more hardened in wickedness than he. So this was really a problem, being governed by Ahab and Jezebel. This was really a problem, okay? And look how Guardini describes it. It was she, Jezebel, who erected everywhere altars of Baal and taught her people the worship of idols. She annihilated the priests of the Lord. For years, Elijah had to hide from her wrath to save his own life. During Ahab's reign, darkness covered the land. Guardini says, the darkness of hell. Okay, that's dark. It was against this dark that Elijah had been sent. He was never able to proclaim the tidings of the coming kingdom. He had to fight to the end against a wall of blackness. What is this wall for Guardini? Hardened disbelief. And with that hardened disbelief, there's violence, blasphemy, and bloodthirstiness that stalked through the land. Elijah's life is one titanic struggle against the powers of evil. Again, ask Elijah, or ask Guardini, what the powers of evil, what did they do? Well, they were violent, they blasphemed God, and they were bloodthirsty, and the land was dark. Okay? And as Guardini says, this is a titanic struggle against the powers of evil. I think that's worth repeating. The Spirit of the Lord seethes in Elijah. It lifts him high above the human plane, spanning his strength far beyond the human breaking point. And Guardini points out, once the tension relaxes, he sinks to the desert sand like a spent animal and begs for death. So, I mean, this is a combat stupendous. This is quite a struggle. Okay? But again, the angel touches him, and strengthened by divine refreshment, he does wander 40 days to Horeb, to the holy mountain. Thus, he fights the terrible fight to the finish, relentlessly breaking the power of the idols, until at the given hour, the fiery chariot swings low and bears him off into the unknown. And thus we get the famous spiritual, the famous African-American spiritual, swing low, sweet chariot. And behold, two men were talking with him. Now we're back in the New Testament, the Transfiguration. And these were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory spoke of his death, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. That's found in Luke 9. Moses, who had known the hopelessness of all efforts to rip his people out of the captivity of their own hearts. Elijah, who with both sword and spirit had charged the satanic dark. It is as though the weight of 1.5 millennia, 1,500 years of sacred history had been bundled together and laid upon the shoulders the shoulders of the Lord. All the enmity against God, heritage of 1,000 years of intractability and blindness, he, that is Jesus the Lord, must bear to an end. No wonder we are shocked when Peter, seeing the radiance, that's the radiance of the transfiguration, says to Christ, Master, it's good for us to be here, and let us set up 3 tents, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elijah. The evangelist does well to add, not knowing what he said. Here's what Guardini says. It is the comprehension of a child who, witnessing something terrible and ignorant of what it is, thinks it's beautiful because it shines. The presence of Moses and Elijah connote something absolutely terrible about the burden that Jesus is going to bear on the cross. That's worth pondering, and it turns out to be Holy Week, so it's a deeper pondering than we do any other week of the year. But that's what it is. In spite of their strangeness, two passages from this period give us an inkling of what Jesus' attitude at the time. First one is and when they had come to Capernaum, those who were collecting the didrachma came to Peter and said, "Does your master not pay the didrachma, the temple tax?" He said, "Yes." But when he had entered the house, Jesus spoke first, saying, "What dost thou think, Simon? From whom do the kings of earth receive tribute or custom? From their own sons or from others?" And he said, "From others." Jesus said to him, "The sons then are exempt. But that we may not give offense to them, go to the sea, catch the hook, and take the first fish that comes up, and opening its mouth thou wilt find a stater. Take that and give it to them for me and for thee." So here's the point that Guardini mines from this passage. Jesus is the king's son by right, exempt from all such burdens. By right, he and his followers should live as lords in his Father's land. Instead, let us pay the temple money, that they have no grounds for complaint against us. He does freely what he doesn't have to. And again, Jesus replied to Herod in Luke 13. The words peal like an echo from long sunken ages, Guardini tells us. They could have stood in Genesis or in some saga of forgotten heroism. "Behold," says Jesus, "I cast out devils and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I am to end my course." These 3 days of our transitoriness, today, tomorrow, and the third day. And then the terrible irony, for it cannot be that a prophet perish outside Jerusalem. Here's how Guardini interprets this. He says, "Law from the abyss of the human heart. No one sent by God's love to his people shall die a natural death. And nowhere shall he die unnaturally, but in the holy city, where the temple stands, the throne of the heavenly monarch's glory." Do we begin to sense something of the dreadful mystery that overshadows the Lord? It's a dreadful mystery. It's just like you don't really want to look at it, but you're called to look at it with grace and with love, especially during Holy Week. Okay? To be a prophet is to know the meaning behind all events, says Guardini, to interpret them from God's perspective. Jesus is the fulfillment of all prophetic being. He's the heir of human history, the all-knowing one who bears everything that is in his heart, who receives it into his will and consummates it. It is his mission to bring human fate with its sin and need to completion, to explore the limitations resulting from the freedom given the little creature man and not trespassed upon by the omnipotent Creator, because he desires that freedom. So this whole mystery hinges on freedom, on the freedom of the little creature that God allows. It's a terrible beauty, our freedom, isn't it? And he goes on. It is Jesus' task to recognize the wickedness and fearfulness that issue from such freedom. Things that should not be, need not be, yet since they do exist, they have to be expiated. And who's going to do that? Here, in the ultimate, stands the pure, supreme readiness of Jesus' love. Jesus is going to expiate it. In that double sphere of possibility and necessity to which the ancients shudderingly referred as fate, and which we know to be the love of God. Now notice that. Before we knew fully how Jesus, the Lord, operated in history, all this was kind of summarized under that dark word, fate. But Jesus transforms that very dark and unpersonal word, as it were, fate, by his power into love. Now, that's really worth pondering. He is overcoming all fate. All fate. No matter what you feel you're fated to. Jesus, in his love, is overcoming it. That's what Guardini's saying. Wow. That's worth thinking about, especially during Holy Week. Here, Guardini continues, in the ultimate stands the pure supreme readiness of Jesus' love. Repeating it, but it's worth repeating. In that double sphere of possibility and necessity to which the ancients shudderingly referred to as fate, and which we know to be the love of God. Knowing down to the very root, willing in all the clarity of his decision, the Lord's heart sets the inmost mystery in motion, launching what is known as redemption, the new beginning. Please ponder that question that John F. Kennedy asked the peace activists. What did he say to them? It was May 1st, 1962. He met with these peace activists. And as they were talking, he held them longer than he made the other people wait for his appointment, his next appointments, because he wanted to talk to them more. And at one point, he looked at them and said, "You believe in redemption, don't you?" Well, in this particular chapter, Romano Guardini does a great job highlighting more of what that redemption that we believe in really is. Let's ponder it carefully. Thank you very much.